It's interesting for me, after having been off last week on some study leave, which was mostly spent recovering from an illness, but I was able to review some research I've been looking over for the last few weeks, and how a conversation that transpired this past week on Tuesday with a young person in the community here that lives in the surrounding community. And it's those two things that bring me to the sermon that I present to you today. I chose the Corinthian passage primarily because I'm a big fan of Paul. I've always been a fan of Paul, even though he has a lot to be criticized about as well. However, it's an odd thing to hear this greeting when you hear it from that passage in Corinthians, because there was a lot going on. A lot of disruption in the various house churches in the day, and things just weren't going as planned. And yet Paul could see that the Spirit was something that could keep things together as people were planning their future ministries back in those days. If only people would trust the Spirit and let go of a sense of individualism that they were even developing in their own ministries in their house churches. Let us pray. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are strength and our Redeemer. It's in his great book, The Heart of Christianity, that some people from around here are doing and spending a bit of time working with. Marcus Borg of Oregon State University describes how his university students have a uniformly negative image of Christianity. He says, when I ask them to write a short essay on their impression of Christianity, they consistently use 5 adjectives. Christians are literalistic, anti-intellectual, self-righteous, judgmental, and bigoted. Now, Christians might object rather defensively, and that it's unfair to draw such sweeping conclusions based upon the report of any one person. But if you think that way, you'd be right in your logic, but you would be wrong in your conclusion. A book called Unchristian by David Kinnaman of the Barna Group presents some very objective research that supports Borg's subjective anecdote. In fact, Kinnaman's 3-year study documents how an overwhelming percentage of 16 to 29-year-olds view Christians with a great sense of hostility, resentment, and disdain. These broadly and deeply negative views of Christians aren't just superficial stereotypes with no bias in reality, says Kinnaman, nor are the critics people who've had no contact with churches or Christians. In fact, it would be a tragic mistake, he argues, for believers to protest that outsider outrage at Christians is a misperception. Rather, it's based upon their real experiences with today's Christians' communities in some places. According to the Kinnaman-Barna study, here are the percentages for you outside the church who think the following words best describe present-day Christianity. Anti-homosexual, 91%. Judgmental, 87%. Hypocritical, 85%. Old-fashioned, 78%. Too political, 75%. Out of touch with reality, 72%. Insensitive to others, 70%. Boring, 68%. Now, it would be hard to overestimate, says Kinnaman, how firmly people reject and feel rejected by Christians. Or think about it this way, he suggests. When you introduce yourself as a Christian to a friend or to a neighbor or to a business associate who is an outsider to the Christian community, you might as well have it tattooed on your arm that you are anti-homosexual, you are a gay hater, and you're homophobic. I doubt you think of yourself in these terms, but that's what some outsiders think of you. Gabe Lyons, in the Fermi Project, the research that I was reading through, who commissioned the Barna research, remembers his own first look at this very data. He says, and I quote, "I'll never forget sitting in Starbucks," a good place to be, by the way, "pouring through the research on my laptop. As I soaked it in, I glanced at the people around me and was overwhelmed with the thought that this is what they think of me. It was a sobering thought to know that if I had stood up and announced myself as a Christian to the customers assembled in Starbucks that day, they would have associated me with every one of the negative perceptions described in this book." End of quote. So Borg was right. Maybe even more right than he knew. But it wasn't always this way. In fact, in John's Gospel that we heard from this morning, this week, Jesus speaks for the first time. When Andrew and a friend had asked Jesus where he was staying, Jesus said, "Come and see." And so they did, spending the entire day with this Jesus. They were so taken by that one day with Jesus that the first thing Andrew did was, writes John, was to find his brother and Peter and say, "Peter, come and see." The very next day, John writes, Philip grabs Nathanael and said the same thing. "Come and see." And thus were the unlikely beginnings of an improbable movement at that time. The Gospels record how throngs of people were so captivated by the preaching and the teaching and the healing of this Jesus that they did in fact come and see for themselves. And based upon what they experienced with this Jesus, their lives were radically reoriented. And then there's the simple greeting of Paul's letter to the Corinthians from the epistle, which I find so instructive when I read it. It was to that very troubled group of believers. There were sectarian divisions. There was boasting about incest and of a kind that does not even occur among pagans. Lawsuits between fellow Christians, eating food that had been sacrificed to pagan idols, disarray in worship services, and predatory pseudo-preachers masquerading as super apostles. To these people, Paul wholeheartedly wished them grace and peace. He said that he hoped they would be enriched in every way by the Spirit, and he wished them only good. Consider what our world, our 21st century world, might be like if we offered our neighbor a similar wish for their well-being. Following the example of Jesus, the first Christians broke down social barriers. They disregarded religious taboos that judged people as ritually clean or unclean, worthy or unworthy, respectable or disrespectable. They subverted normal social hierarchies of wealth, ethnicity, religion, and gender in favor of a radical egalitarianism before God and with each other. It says There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. In a word, the first believers were very generous. They demonstrated authentic transparency, not moral superiority or ulterior motives. And like their Lord, they exuded compassion rather than condemnation. They lived out of gratitude, not fear, and had a reputation for empathy rather than spending time fault-finding with other people. The first followers of Jesus were people of self-sacrifice, not self-interest. They insisted that God was like a tender father, not some vindictive tyrant, and encouraged every person without exception to believe what the psalmist once said, "This I know, that God is for me." Now, a generation after the first believers, it was the great theologian Justin Martyr who summarized the appeal of the Christian community when he said, "Those who once delighted in fornication now embrace chastity alone. We who once took most pleasure in accumulating wealth and property now share with everyone in need. We who hated and killed one another and would not associate with men of different tribes because of their different customs, now, since the coming of Christ, live familiarly with them and pray for our enemies." End of quote. And similarly, Tertullian, who wrote these great words, said, "Our care for the derelict in our active love become for us our distinctive sign before the enemy. See," they say, "how they love one another, and how ready they are to die for each other." End of quote. Oh, how I wish that we could somehow recapture the witness of those first believers who, because great grace was with them all, demonstrated overflowing generosity to their neighbors, and who consequently enjoyed the favor of all the people. I wish those traits could be what Tertullian called our distinctive mark, instead of what most people today think of when they hear the word Christian. The pattern can be seen in a story from the Gospel of John. Two men approach Jesus and ask, "Where are you staying?" And Jesus replies, "Come and see." And Andrew rushes to his brother Simon. It is such a simple story, so simple, but John seems to want us to see something significant, and he concludes with the words that signal the beginning of the Christian church. "You are Simon, son of John. You are called to be Cephas." You see, John wants us to see that simple words of invitation are more crucial to the life of redemption than even proclamations of faith. This is how the church begins. Come and see. Christ invites us to enter into a shared life with this gracious host, and from this point on, the way to truth will be constituted primarily by personal encounters. Our evangelism is simply a reflection of this truth. Andrew invites Simon to come and see. We welcome because we have been welcomed ourselves. We invite because we received an invitation ourselves. when I was in ministry at Eden United in Mississauga. It was one evening after a council meeting that I left the church and walked out the one door by where the AA group was meeting. And the AA was about to break up and leave for the night. When I got outside, I noticed a man crouched over the hood of a very rusty old Ford truck. And he introduced himself to me as one of the people who attended AA. He sighed, and he told me how long he had intended to get back to church, and so I invited him to worship. I remember his face flushed, and he launched into the story of his life in that parking lot. It was a familiar string of regrets and loss that accompanied his addiction. We shared a prayer, and we both said good night. But I remember that as I was walking back to my own car, he called after me with urgency, and he said, "Did you mean, Barry, what you said?" "About what?" I asked. "Did you mean that I could come to church?" Driving home, it occurred to me that he had told me his life story as a response to my invitation. It was his polite way of explaining why he couldn't take me up on my offer. You see, he felt he wasn't clean enough to be included in our congregation. I never saw him again. Oh, how I wish my response to his questions had been more direct. I wish I had simply repeated the words of Christ. I wish I had just said, "Come and see." The disciples' simple question challenges us in the church today, I believe, to ask, what is it that we are seeking? They were seeking a person, Jesus, to know him, to follow him, and to model their lives after him. Most of us, I believe, have to admit that one of the challenges for us of discipleship, a word that we're not even really very friendly with, is not to lose sight of the true center and the focus of our ministry. Jesus. That's it. Jesus. Especially in the light of the church, it's easy for it to become all about us. All about our buildings. All about our programs. Above all, it is not about loss, right? We want to grow, we want to gain, we want to expand, and yet we hear and feel that discipleship costs something. What losses are we willing to suffer for the sake of the gospel? Are we willing to forego recognition and popularity when we so easily enjoy both life in the life of the church? Maybe we have missed God, and maybe we've missed Jesus. Maybe we've just really missed the point of it all. Let me close with this true story that is shared by renowned preacher Thomas Long. He shares in this way. He says, "I grew up in a small congregation outside of Atlanta of farmers and teachers. One Sunday in the middle of our worship service, a man we had never seen before burst through the back door of the church, and as every eye in the congregation was trained on him, he made his way down the side aisle of the church. Who was he? We were near the tracks of the Southern Railroad, and perhaps he was a drifter who had ridden on the rods of a boxcar. He stared at us, and we stared at him. Our minister stopped preaching and stared at him. He stared back. Suddenly, a strange look crossed his face, and he bolted back out the door, never to be seen by us ever again. For weeks after every service, the adults would gather under the trees in the front yard of the church, and they would discuss and they would debate what had happened. Finally, they came to a red clay farmer's theological consensus, and it was not that a vagrant had disrupted our service. It was rather that we had failed some moral test, that God had sent us a stranger and we had not responded as we were called to do. This experience, this story, had become a part of the local canon of our congregation, a reminder of our frailty and a guide to our ethical life. We did not know, but it would have surprised us to know, that the Christian church had already added this experience to its own narrative canon. End of quote. As a great 3rd century catechetical document by Didascalia states, and I quote, he said, "If a destitute man or woman arrives unexpectedly and there is no place, you, bishop, make such a place with all you hear, even if you yourself should sit on the ground, so that your ministry may be pleasing before God." I say to all of us this morning, at a time when the church is tempted to become just another appealing commodity for middle-class consumers, these texts this morning from John's Gospel and from Corinthians poses a significant challenge to our communities of faith. Do our words and deeds bear witness to this Jesus we identify with? And when you and I invite people to come, when we invite them to come, do you think they'll see Jesus in our midst? May it be so for you. May it be so for me.